Thank you so much for lending an ear and joining us in this presentation. Um, I am an artist, and so when I refer to a lot of the plants, it's not with a lot of deep knowledge, and I'm in the process of gaining understanding. But I do have a fundamental belief and understanding that they are essential to um, restoring wildlife passages no matter what scale. So I love urban gardens because it allows us to practice native plant restoration at a scale that is really accessible for anyone. You can grow a little pot of native flowers and be contributing to the urban forage for pollinators, which ties into the broader ecology, of course. So, so I've been spending the last, 6, 7 years exploring ecology, learning about plants in general. This was largely done in Maine, actually. And we returned home to Colorado about 3 or 4 years ago. And my friend Mabel Sutton said that, oh, you got to go by the Stiles Center because they need some help. So after returning home, I revisited this place in Five Points called the Stiles African American Heritage Center. It was founded by Grace Stiles, um, and she was a public school teacher for about 40 years and did not like the representations of African Americans in public school curriculums. So her intention was really to start changing the narratives that are present in our culture to include a stronger sense of what African Americans contributed to American culture. And, um, she started this out of a trunk in her car and then started her center in the 90s when I was attending East High School here in Denver. So this kind of intro page has the address, of course. It has the phone number of Kala Green, who is Grace's daughter and the current director of the center. And it also has a link to the Arts and Venues website where you can find a pretty long list of grants available for the creative industries in Denver. The grant that after I went by and looked at the garden, I came up with the idea of trying to frame it from an arts perspective and apply for a PSUR Here grant. And this was $10,000. The parameters were that it had to be in a public space. Most people will do it in a public park, but the area between the street and the sidewalk is actually city property, even though the property owner has to maintain it. It actually belongs to the city. So it was a bit of a stretch, but they approved it in this space. And then the other parameter took some creativity to get around was that it is for a temporary art installation. So when proposing something, you have to include a plan for deinstallation. And the purpose, of course, was to install a garden. We did not want to take the garden out. So my plan for deinstallation was to be distributing the seeds of the native plants to area gardeners. So we would be deinstalling the plants by actually sharing the plants. And of course, to be able to do so, the plants need to stay in place and keep on producing seeds. And they bought it. So they do not expect that the garden will come away. But this is the center. um, and a view of the interior garden. Now, Grace, unfortunately, is currently in memory care, so she is not physically present, even though she is still with us. She doesn't visit the center maybe more than once a year. Um, so because she wasn't present, it became pretty abandoned looking. So there were a couple of ladies, Georgiana and Nancy, who started by enclosing this, what we're going to call the interior garden. They put up a fence. There were 3 layers of weed cloth that was smothering the ground. I remember in the 90s when Grace first purchased this house, someone donated landscaping, and it was the 90s, and there was this miracle cloth that we all now know is terrible, but that's what they donated. So it ended up after 30 years, it was under 3 layers of weed cloth, and they did the heroic task of taking it out of the interior garden here. The porch was kind of falling apart, and they added a fence and really got the ball started. Like, let's start upkeeping the exterior of the center so that people know it's still up and going. Grace's daughter, Kala, is a civil engineer, and her time is pretty limited. So she opens the center Saturday afternoons from 2 to 4, and she gives tours. It's an old Victorian house. They have lovely installations. I hear time and time again, it feels like your grandmother's house. So I invite you all to come and discover the interior of the center Saturday afternoons. But of course, the outdoor spaces have the potential of engaging people at any time. And so that was really our primary intention. As the space is open such limited hours, how can we share the content of what's in the space and bring it outdoors so people can really experience it as they're passing by? So this was the space that we targeted for the grant. It's what's known as, or sometimes known as the hell strip, because it's harder to get water out there, and it's often on a property, it's the space that is more often left untended. I know that Maggie has also called it the tree strip, which I think is more delightful. But considering the condition that we approached it, which is like this, you can see in this area the top layer of weed cloth coming through, and it was being held down by these railroad ties. Um, we have a few bushes, including Russian sage, and I think that it's called a Caryopteris, the Asian blue flowered plant. Um, and otherwise, as I'm sure you all know, only the worst weeds grow through the weed cloth. So that was our first challenge. And then this is the corner garden. There's what looks like a chokeberry bush under this elm. And there's an invasive elm, Chinese elm here. And then these are the Russian sage that Grace actually planted in the 90s when that original landscaping was donated. So this is essentially what we started with as far as the public access space around the center. Um, and the way we approached it, of course, was to first take out all the weed cloth, which was amazing. And it's amazing to look at the sculpted clay earth after 30 years of people just kind of walking through it. The other thing that the weed cloth did was really keep the space open so that we struggled with a lot of, pet waste, dog poop that people didn't clean up, and a lot of trash would fill up the space. So those were our primary considerations. I think that it's that it's always important to consider material potentials when you look at a space. And one gift was that every time they added a layer of weed cloth, they used gravel to hold it down. So after 30 years of this oak shedding its leaves and the leaves decomposing in the gravel, we actually have a pretty decent planting medium that's present on the site. It was spread evenly across the site, but once we started tearing out the weed cloth and digging into it, you can see on the left here, it started changing the topography of the space. So on the right, you will see a series of plants that are not native. And in doing our site assessment, um, we we are considering all of the plants that are present on the site, and their significance. So I guess what I'm trying to say, while we're having a focus on native plants, it's also an African American Heritage Center, and that there are plants associated with that history that are significant. So, for example, in the bottom right, here is vinca. I would say it's probably one of the plants that is the most baneful for most native plant enthusiasts. But, this is a plant that when Africans were still being held in slavery and when they lost their loved ones, they, of course, they didn't have the capacity to bury them with a headstone. So they would actually plant this periwinkle or vinca on the graves of their loved ones. And if you search the Periwinkle Project, there is some effort throughout the Southeast to find these resting places through looking at the vinca growing in these different areas that were nearby to the quarters that they were living in. So I think that that's pretty significant. And I think that by allowing the space for these to continue growing is really giving attention to that that time and that situation. On the upper right here, we have violet. It is the smelly European kind, and it's also an ingredient that Madame C.J. Walker used in her beauty products, which she refined here in Denver. So we welcome this plant, even though it is the European kind. It is exploding all over the inner garden around the house. Now, there are, of course, several native Colorado violets, and we are working on, cultivating these from seeds so that we can add them to the collection. But for now, the European ones are given the space to be there because they're a part of the history of Madame Walker. And she is pretty extraordinary. She was the first woman self-made millionaire in the United States. She accomplished that through really celebrating African American beauty. Instead of encouraging people to bleach their appearance to look more in line with European beauty ideals, they really emphasized working with African American women to heighten their natural beauty from an African perspectives. The other thing she did was come up with the franchise, which is a pretty influential business model. But what it did was just gave African American women the capacity to improve their own livelihoods. by selling her product. So she's one of our focused kind of figures that are tied to Denver, and this is her plant. Now, when we think about the Colorado native violets, they are the host species for our fritillary butterflies. And, just in my mind, I think that there is no better symbol or representation of the transformation that Madame C.J. Walker accomplished in her lifetime. So we are taking kind of the plants that are associated with some of these historical figures and then looking at kind of the ecological relationships on with the native varieties of those plants or the plants themselves if they are native, and thinking about how to tie in these larger ecological presences or systems, you know, sharing how they're tied into the pollinators or the local birds or whatnot. So, and then the last plant here is what I think I think it's a caryopteris. I don't even know if I'm saying it correctly, but it's a plant that thrives in dry ecologies. I think it's from Asia, and I believe in Japan they use it as a medicine. And again, we welcome this plant, even though it's not native. It I feel is a nod to Five Points being a place that welcomed Japanese families after that terrible time of internment. So, as a nod to that kind of historical welcoming of this particular community, this is a plant that Grace planted in the 90s, and it survived being completely neglected. So we're happy to keep it in place, and it has really just kind of rebounded as a prominent shrub layer of the garden today. So returning to the oak side, we kept a lot of the leaves. They're super rich in nitrogen. And then from, you can see we're kind of shuffling the dirt back and forth. And from this, we ended up structuring vertical stones. And if you look at this set of stones right here is this back set of stones here. And the purpose of structuring them against the sidewalk was to kind of create a barrier so that when people were walking their dogs, the dog noses didn't get too far into the garden. And so it is kind of a barrier. You have to go around the fringes or look for the more subtle pathways into the garden to be able to slow down and find the path, which part of which is being defined by the stepping stones that we mentioned earlier and something that I'll get back to in a little bit. But it's the first part of this, of course, is to structure kind of a foundation to the overall garden that functions to serve the needs expressed by the organization. So one was to help reduce the amount of waste in the garden. Another was to change the topography. We started this nearly a year and a half ago. And at the time, there were, a bunch of tents set up across the street. And we wanted to make a beautiful space, but the one that would be hard to set up an encampment. So the verticality and the chopping up of the typography was to serve the concern of people sleeping in the space, really, is what it came down to. So the other role of vertical stones in a garden that we don't intend to water once it's established is that it gets water deep into the earth because, of course, Denver is on an old lake bed. So there's a lot of clay rich soil, which on one hand is great because there's a lot of minerals in the soil, but it can be hard for roots and water to penetrate. So by placing stones vertically in the garden, the water kind of follows them down. Um, follows the stone down to reach these deeply rooted native plants. And then I referenced the gravel soil mixture that came off of the weed cloth, and that's really a perfect structure to fill the in-between spaces. It was inspired by a crevice garden. I know that formal crevice gardens are much tighter packed with the stones, but I think that the scale of this, um, it seems like the plants are really kind of growing to fill in these kind of larger spaces. So it's allowing space for the plants to kind of get bigger, I guess. So um, on the other side of the stack you just saw, we structured in a bench. And so when we think of kind of how the story of the landscape unfolds, in this area, we added a smaller square fence around the oak tree. So as you approach the garden from the west, the fence is directly along the sidewalk, again, to help guide the dog noses to stay in on the sidewalk. And then there is a pathway over, it's not photographed here, but there is a pathway along the street along the back. And that is actually intended to, to be the garden access. There are stepping stones that go across the top here now, which lead you in, and there's signposts that invite people to know to come into the garden to kind of slow and meander instead of kind of walking quickly along the sidewalk. But the intention really was to start off with this kind of caged or box space and think about the plants that were used on the Underground Railroad. That was a theme that was big for Grace. And a couple of the historical figures we chose to attach to this project had an association with the Underground Railroad. Um, Out of this confined space, we envisioned these plants that were used as food and medicine to be spilling out of the the fence, essentially. So oak was a plant that was used on the Underground Railroad. People consumed the acorns. Um, Another plant was alliums. So we planted the wild garlic chives and chives as perennial herbs that can withstand very dry areas. We are in the process of growing our collection of the native nodding onions to add to the alliums. And again, they're just plants that are considered both weeds and as being useful. So we are looking to things like dandelion and how it was used to help freedom seekers kind of uh, make it through to their destination. So that's what kind of the starting point of thinking about how the landscape has the potential to kind of share a story in the way that visitors are invited to approach and walk through the space. I wanted to add a little resting space, so structured in a stone bench. And I think that this photo kind of gives us the sense that landscaping, when you're starting from the beginning like this, is really very sculptural. And certainly I approach it as an artist as a very similar process that I use in my paintings is you're thinking about form, you're thinking about function, you're thinking about the relationship of objects, the way your eyes and in a garden space, your actually body moves through the work. And I thought it was important to invite people to pause and sit. This bench is surrounded now by tea plants because they are medicine and because Grace loved hosting teas. So what we did, because she loves hosting teas, was starting by hosting Saturday afternoon teas. And this is, you'll notice they are all during the time that Kala is available to be at the center. So they are a layered kind of gathering where people can go through and take a tour and discover the center itself. We, serve tea, of course, so there are refreshments, and places for people to gather and talk and explore inside. And we typically will be doing something in the garden as well. So when we sat down with Kala and the people who are associated with the center, we chose a handful of historical figures that were, both tied to Denver and demonstrated a strong relationship with plants in some way um, as part of their professional life here. So the first person, hands down, that flew out of Kala's mouth was Aunt Clara Brown. And she was born into slavery, but given her freedom, joined a wagon train out to Denver, ended up owning quite a bit of real estate, actually. She was allowed to invest here and welcoming other African Americans who were arriving in the West. So she was a healer. Um, and she carried with her a deep understanding and respect for the sacred plant relationships expressed in indigenous practice. So her father was Cherokee, and one of her best friends when she arrived in Denver became Ginny Jones, who was Arapaho, but obviously married into the church. They became close friends and shared a lot about what native plants were medicinal and used for healing in this relatively, new land for her. Certainly coming from the East, things were a bit different, though there are some overlaps, of course. So this was where we started, it's sharing the structure of the stones, sharing the purpose of the gardens, and also as an invitation for people to share what they know about the history and plant relationships and whatnot. And this is what the gathering looked like. It was a lot of fun. We happened to be hosting these two lovely women, young women from Malawi and Nigeria as part of World Denver's African Youth Program, something. I'm forgetting what it was named. So they had a great time making tea cakes. That was something they had not done before. Here in the middle, you see Nancy and Georgianne. They are the two women who started the interior garden. And they're getting love from several teachers from a local science club who are excited to start using the space to activate more youth programming that bridge kind of history and science and creative acts. Over here is Kala giving a tour to more of the the youth from Africa who are visiting. My family has always been a big part of these efforts. Here you see my son Thatcher with Jacoby. They both put a lot of strength into structuring and moving around earth and laying stone, and I think are really admirable young men for doing so. And you see our young African guest. This is my mother, who was very, very close to Grace. And on the right is Miss Mabel Sutton, who is the one who instigated the original idea of the garden, and said has offered a lot of guidance through the whole process. And these, uh, my mom, Sonia, Mabel, and Grace are all Southern women. Um, and I think that's why they became close initially, is because they just have something in common from the culture they grew up in. So part of that is a real appreciation for hosting teas, feeding people, making people feel welcome. And I think that that's has become one of the intentions of the project, both in the garden and through the activities of the garden in activating the space of the center as it's in transition. We got a big gift of corn seed from Spirit of the Sun during that gathering, and it was great to kick off with a lot of just wonderful enthusiasm and good energy. So as the garden started growing, we welcome pop-ups, native plants. Of course, this is a milkweed that is um, came up last year, and this is a photo of it just emerging a couple days ago again. So as you can see, it is right on the curb. It must have taken root at the edge of the weed cloth, but it's wonderful to see, always to see this kind of plant arrive on its own and present itself. And of course, we take the flexible approach of welcoming this kind of arrival. Um, and again, just looking at the seasons, Nancy and Georgian planted a lot of salvia, which was serving the pollinators well. We started looking at all the dandelions and shifting our perception away from them being weeds to being more useful plants. Looking at the oaks, realizing the potential of the nitrogen in the leaves as they're breaking down, and just kind of getting to know the plants that are present on site and the potentials that they offer. So I pulled out one of these illustrations of the dandelion and made a card with all of the uses of the dandelion. It is a medicine, it's a tonic, it's you get your greens, you can add the petals to an assortment of baked goods. But it's a really lovely plant, and we are happy now to welcome it. On the right, is another native plant that is often misunderstood. I have a colleague, Moyo Kadiji from Nigeria, and he does a lot with, looking at culture from and within the African diaspora. And I asked him, when you arrived from West Africa, what plant were you surprised or happy or to see, to find here growing? And I didn't expect him to say it, but he said amaranth. And when I looked into it, there are only a couple of varieties that grow in Africa and Europe. where there are hundreds that grow through the Americas. And it makes me laugh because the direct translation of this plant means husband fattener. So they eat the greens. And he said, in fact, I chose both of my houses because the gardens were full of this plant. And in my mind, I'm thinking, most Americans would see that and just completely think of a as a weed yard or a yard full of weeds and it being a big problem. But in fact, I think it's really important to just kind of step back and consider these little statements like that because we can put ourselves in the place of people who arrived here in the early days against their will, and how some of them must have discovered this familiar and nourishing green. And so I think that it's really important to, again, provide the space for these plants that really held a very important role for the survival of of um, of people who were seeking freedom here on these lands. Speaking of nourishment, Barney Ford is another of our featured historical figures. He was actually welcomed to the West by Aunt Clara Brown, interestingly enough, and became quite the entrepreneur himself. So he found gold, but really attained or retained his wealth by running restaurants and hotels, both in Denver and I think in Wyoming and Breckenridge. And he was able to figure out a way to get fresh oysters in on the train. But he also became just kind of a culinary master of wild game meat. And so we decided that to make an ecological tie with his history or his role or I guess position in the West here, um, we would include a kind of a micro meadow, I guess, if you would, um, where we look at the plant communities in high plains ecology and how the game meat kind of fits into that. He actually served prairie dog as well, which I am very curious to find a recipe for. Um, One thing to note, so you can see the signs here, which we felt was a good way to bring the information and the faces out into the public space. Um, One thing that we included on our budget that we ended up not using was, I guess the original idea from Nancy and Georgianne was to install a set of raised corrugated metal beds. But instead, we had all of these railroad ties. So instead of the corrugated metal, we decided to take a more naturalistic approach to changing the topography and simply stacking these railroad ties around the old stump of that invasive elm that I pointed out at the very beginning. It felt like the railroad ties were appropriate, especially in relationship to Barney Ford's sign, because he found his way along the Underground Railroad for some time. And I think that really speaks to his journey. This is a photo that I took just a couple days ago. So you can see that it has been topped with a squeegee, but just seeded. So this is in process of being established. Let's say this is a kind of a new structure from this spring. Um, you can see some of the Russian sage is still present. It is spreading a lot in this area. And we are taking the approach of simply kind of folding it out, I keep on saying. So we're digging up portions and we give it away to neighbors. So, like the neighbor around the corner, for example, has some chickens and he's wondering what he can grow. I said, here, try some Russian sage. Chickens don't often like very smelly things. Or giving some to a 3-year-old little girl who's passing by with her mom, and just giving her a handful. Here, try growing this. It really doesn't matter if you fail, we're taking it out anyway. Um, Commencing this relationship of sharing plants, I think is really an essential component to the garden. I know that Russian sage is not celebrated, it's not native, but it's there's still value for pollinators and there's still value for giving it to a 3-year-old knowing that she's going to try and very possible that the plant will die, but it doesn't matter because it's that trying part that's really the most important. So eventually we're going to fold out the plants like Russian sage. They will be replaced by the native plants and other significant plants. And then the more aggressive of the natives will continue passing out and giving out, both as we tend to reducing the number of weeds, um, and also by encouraging people to harvest seeds to take and grow in their own spheres. So this is another example of the sign that we're using. And it's just a little bit about the history of the person, and then the relationship with plants in the landscapes, and then a QR code to where you can learn more about the particular subject. These are the 3 figures that I think I've touched on all of them. Um, I will say that the other ingredient that Madame C.J. Walker used in her products was rose. So rose is a keystone species. I think we have 5 native roses, and we're looking forward to exploring how those roses fit more into the ecology. Um, I think that Afro natural beauty is a topic that's really important to continue discussing. I think all beauty is a topic important to continue discussing because of the endocrine disrupting chemicals that is often present in many, many beauty products. So beyond, uses for medicine or food, we can think about our relationship with how we consume plants on our bodies as well, because our bodies are really like sponges. Okay, so the third kind of historical tea, these are not in order that we hosted, was to honor Madame C.J. Walker. She worked very closely with her daughter, and so we decided to do a Mother's Day tea uh, honoring her. And this is what it looked like. We had a wonderful group of people, board members from Wild Ones, the Front Range chapter or Denver chapter of Wild Ones, including Ian, which I know is in this talk. Thank you so much. And I wanted to just go through a few of the photos of the seedlings that they brought with them and helped plant, and then go through what they look like now a year later. Such a gift. Thank you so much. And I think part of what we discussed here was kind of an idea of a community garden not being defined by separate spaces or being defined by a master plan as much as taking a responsive approach to what is growing, the relationship between the things that are growing, and then as an extension, the relationship between this garden and other growing spaces in the neighborhood. So how can we provide space for the plants to thrive? How can we share the plants? How can we work in balance, kind of as an open-ended approach of people who know and love the history, know and love the plants, know and love the neighborhood, the figures, the uses, all of this, and form these relationships that are a little bit more informal in that, yeah, we do have events and programming, but we also want to invite people into this space to interact with it in ways that are not yet fully defined. So you can see this very small currant spring, and this, I think it was competing with a number of these sunflowers you can see at the bottom, but this one in particular really just shot up. So it's really exciting to see how much it grew in the first year. See the little thin line of yarrow that we planted in kind of a big space between the vertical stones. And this is the same little strand of yarrow as it kind of exploded this spring. I was there a couple days ago. And this is what has, you can see it's already flowered, and you can see some of the little babies coming up. Um, Aster on the left was really stringy and kind of sparse, but it sent out a lot of blooms. And this is the same aster on the right here. You can see it really does, even though the spaces in the stones are quite a bit larger than traditional crevice gardens, you can see how the plants really just kind of expand and fill the space. The echinacea became this. This one is here. This is the sage. It's a culinary sage. I'm pretty sure it's not native, but it was used on the Underground Railroad. So this is on one side of the bench. And yeah, it's super exciting to see how it's all just kind of exploding. I think that's one of the biggest gifts about working with native plants, like the end of the first year, which is this photo on the left. It, it looks like, they're coming in, they're catching hold, but then the following spring on the second year, it's just super exciting to see how they explode. So I don't know, Maggie, if there are any questions, we can pause here. I have another kind of, it's a good transition point.
Well, Lily, thank you so much. There are no questions yet. If anyone wants to make a question right now, you're free to do that verbally or write it in the chat.
No worries.
I did find a lot of things that I wanted to talk to you about. I was I was totally blown away by what you were saying about the vinca. Um, when I used to teach for a Bard College, in New York. And when I was there for the last time before taking this job, I was staying at a house in Red Hook, and this, I'm putting this in the chat. This like cemetery was right across the street from my house, and this famous uh horticulturalist was buried there. And I found vinca flowering in on January 15th in upstate New York in this in this um in this graveyard. So what you were saying just sounded so crazy and wonderful.
That's
Uh,
great. Yeah, it's an amazing plant for sure. When I was in Maine, I learned that the French brought it to that area actually as a tea plant.
really?
Yes, you can brew the leaves like tea.
Oh, I had no idea. The things you learned.
Right. So I chose this as a transition point because from here we're gonna jump a little bit further south so that I can share a bit about working within another community from the African diaspora in Haiti. And I started in 2013 participating in the Ghetto Biennial, which was a biennial event. Uh, I, if you're in the art world, you may be familiar with these international biennials. And there's a photographer from London, Leah Gordon, who became fascinated with this particular group of artists in Port-au-Prince, um, right downtown along the Grand Rue. Um, and she has built this incredible event, bringing international artists to Haiti to work in collaboration with these artists. So if you Google it, there's quite a bit information. They just won a well-respected award from the German government in regards to the documenta this last year, where they were able to show their work. So they've gained some pretty big accolades. But what I was really interested in when attending the event was plants and working with grandmothers and figuring out plant relationships in this area that is often dismissed. So pretty much the area that we worked in is considered a red zone, and red zones were delineated by the UN as too poor or too dangerous for foreign NGOs to work. So when you sign up for an NGO, you sign this contract. I won't go into these areas, otherwise I'll be sent home immediately. So this was really curious. These are areas where there are not enough beds for everyone to sleep at once. So people have to sleep in shifts, right? And so I started contemplating what, what is the relationship with plants in this context? There is absolutely no space for, what we consider formal gardens, but yet there are trees everywhere. Port-au-Prince is actually one of the most forested cities in the Western Hemisphere, surprisingly. And so I wanted to start by just kind of sitting down. And the first year in 2013, I sat down with grandmothers so that I could slow my own pace and start recognizing or tuning into the rhythms of these communities that are made up of, tangled footpaths that weave their way through shelters that are made from tarps and corrugated iron and actually shift as a I guess, a protective measure, if the alleyways through your neighborhood can change, then it is actually possible to disappear when needed if you're facing some kind of danger or something. So, in slowing down and tuning into the rhythms, you start recognizing a whole bunch of purpose expressed by the people who are traveling through these spaces. In learning how to cook these traditional Creole recipes from the grandmothers, I started deconstructing the ingredients to look at the relationships with the various plants and also to understand the food systems present in this kind of space, especially the space that is so easily dismissed by the international community. And over the years, we started playing around with planting seeds, essentially. What would people be inclined to tend? How could we tie in the act of like cooking to planting these plants that people would be inclined to attend? And with the idea of a food forest, we came up with a way of working where we would host community meals, harvest seeds from the various components of those meals, and then send little seeds and seedlings home with neighborhood kids, so they could grow some of these plants. So, in thinking of a traditional food forest, you have your canopy trees, which are fruit and the native Maya nut. You have your understory trees, which is made of largely of moringa. You have your vines, which in this case on the left is the jumu or the heirloom squash you can see in the meal being prepared here. It trellises over the rooftops, so it doesn't take up a lot of space. And over the rooftops, it adds an insulating layer of green against the tropical heat. And then as I spent more time with these grandmothers, I began to tune into the floral layer of this food forest. And I think that I'm most deeply moved by this incredible act of preservation. Essentially, there are already micro gardens of endemic or native medicinal plants that are tended because of this deeply rooted feeling of connection or sacred relationships between, you know, people of this land and the healing plants. And so I learned the history being that when the first Africans in Haiti escaped slavery, they went into the rugged mountains and were received by the indigenous Taino. And the Taino taught them these sacred plant relationships with these endemic medicinal herbs. And so to this day, in the tightest corners of Port-au-Prince, you have these micro gardens of endemic plants because of this history and because of this very strong feeling of preserving these sacred relationships. And I think it was this situation that allowed me to understand the depth of plant relationships expressed by people who have come from Africa and have maintained garden work here. One of the projects that we visited, I think it was in 2017, the Sadana Forest, which is probably one of the most incredible um, restoration efforts that I've witnessed. This is not their first project. They revived a forest in India over the course of 30 years, and they see that scale of time as necessary in doing so. So taking a permaculture approach, they used the available materials, which in this site you can see in the dry background here, it's pretty much just stones. Uh, the forest was taken away. You know, the torrential rains come and it just washes away the topsoil. So you can see in this patch of forest in the beginning, and this is along the south coast of Haiti. It was quite a journey to get there. But you can see they started structuring these stones using the available materials that they have. And this is a little bit closer up. In this corner, you see this aloe. And around the aloe, you see the stones, but you also see a lot of this pepe. Pepe is a word they use for the used clothing that comes in huge bales from the US. When we give away our clothes, often sometimes it ends up in a used clothes store, but often it is bunched up in these huge bales and sent to places like Haiti or Africa, where it largely becomes a problem of just waste, you know. Um, but they figured out that they could start making little wells to stop the big runoff of water by building these little, dams of the stone, and then using pepe or used clothes that was all cotton to plug up the holes. So it takes a while for it to break down, but it is a natural material. They're not using synthetics. And it is catching every tiny little piece of organic debris that is washing away so that it can start building up the soil again. And when we visited there, they actually had a patch of functioning forest underway. It was probably one of the most incredible projects to just go and witness and see it actually working. This is their greenhouse, their nursery. Again, touching on both material potentials, even when it seems so scarce when your available materials are just stone and pepe, figuring out how to structure that, but then also looking towards your plant potentials. No, they were having a really hard time finding seeds. There wasn't a forest from which to harvest. They did their research. They figured out that the Maya nut, or in Haiti, they call it chocogu, was a native nut tree that had been extinguished from the islands during the plantation eras, but was an important keystone species. So this on the left side, this is for the most part this Maya nut, which they were growing from seed. And they started deciding, well, we're eating fruits here in the kitchen. Let's start figuring out and saving our own seeds. And so that's what they started doing to tune into their material, their plant potentials, and they started growing out the rest of the canopy from the fruit that they were consuming as part of the volunteer program. Um, Back in Port-au-Prince area, um, this is another really extraordinary nursery called Sakala, and it's in the notorious red zone of Cité Soleil. And what this garden is here is it's on a former industrial pad. Um, It has a canopy of moringa trees, and underneath it has raised beds made out of old tires. We send a lot of tires to Haiti. Moringa is a plant. So, when we think about native plants and their importance, we can also consider um, how people who have been uprooted and forced to change geographies, what plants were considered so sacred that they had to carry the seeds with them. When we look at medicine chests from colonial Europeans, even, I think that we can deconstruct sacred plant relationships and look at what plants they chose as the most important that they felt like they could not survive without. And in the case of many Haitians, or who are now Haitians, West Africans, who were, as they were being torn from their homes, they sowed seeds from the moringa tree into the hems of their garments. They didn't know where they were being sent, but they felt like this was a tree that they needed to carry with them. The leaves are a nutrient-dense green that offers an important supplement to the what we call chaos diets. Like after the earthquake or even today in the political chaos, there's not a lot of availability of food. And often people survive off of dry spaghetti. So the moringa is a leaf, an herb, essentially, that you can put on that spaghetti and it'll offer a little bit of a supplement. So, yeah, moringa is very important historically, nutritionally, and in the top left, as one of our shared meals, we distributed little cuttings of moringa that we, put down in reused plastic bottles and allowed them to root. And these kids took home these trees. And you can see how big they've gotten in the few years since we did the little workshop. And I'm so happy that these trees continue to serve these families despite the chaos that continues there now. So I think that's really important to just pay attention to as we approach working with communities, especially from very different places. Is just to kind of slow down, step back, and tune in to what is the most important thing for the people with whom you're working, and what can we learn from that? And how can we structure these plant relationships that make it fulfilling for everyone involved? So integrating creative elements. This is during the Ghetto Biennial. This is a young banana that was planted by Claude and how it matured a year later. As far as integrating arts elements, I feel like observational drawing is a really essential way to encourage students to slow down and think about the relationship within the things that they're drawing, the relationship with the ecology between us and within the species itself that they are drawing from. So in Haiti, it looks, it's quite chaotic, but it's a lot of fun. And we typically will have some food to share and as part of it, distribute seeds and with the know-how or knowledge on how to get those plants growing. Um, Looking at symbols like the lambi shell or the conch shell, which is probably one of the biggest symbols for freedom in Haiti, and painting these with youth and then putting them as circles around new little moringa trees. And if you look very closely at the bottom here, this is my collaborator Moira Williams, who is an artist from the New York area. Back in this workshop, she was kind of tucked behind this crowd working on this little mural that we hung in the corner. Now, these little moringa here, about a year and a half later, became these trees. They're very fast growing trees. And this is Kathleen, who we were working with in her space. So this is just kind of an assortment of how we approach working with plants creatively in a completely different location. And then coming back to Denver, of course, we started with the three T's that looked back into the history, exploring three different figures and how they were associated with the plants in our landscape here in Colorado. And now I think the guard, because we were awarded this grant and it is an arts grant, then from here through the remainder of this year, um, we're going to be integrating more of a creative element. So we have a handful of featured artists. The first one that we featured last fall was Jacqueline Withers. She is a really extraordinary woman who has her fingers in a lot of different things, including being on the board of the Colorado Council of Black Nurses. She also runs the Fly Boys and Girls of club that connects youth to flight lessons. And so she was helping with an installation on Bessie Coleman, who is the first African American woman to hold a pilot's license. So she's the one, I think when we did this event, she's the one with the Council of Black Nurses who really said, we don't, we want to transform this idea of the health strip and see how we can make it a health strip. So I love that conversation that opened the space to really think about how we were doing that by pulling out the weed cloth that was suffocating the ground, and then how to further that with both the plants and the associated stories of the space. So she has created a series, one of which is here of sky paintings to tie in her work with pilots. And as part of that, we're doing a very targeted kind of outreach to certain organizations to do kind of this, shall we say, little activity, creative activity. When I went to art school, it was pretty common to study the visual language of a particular artist and then kind of create in the style of that artist to really explore or feel what it was to create in that style. So we are looking at the artist Jacob Lawrence, who did a phenomenal series of paintings on the Great Migration when African Americans started heading north, leaving the South for better lives. And they ended up in a lot of industrial zones that were pretty cramped, and the style of his paintings really represented that compressed or cramped space. So what we thought of was to invite people to look at the birds who migrate these paths every year and then represent them in the style of Jacob Lawrence, which really compresses the space. Because really, as birds go through urban spaces, they are challenged by some of those similar kind of compressed spaces through the urban corridors. So it's, a way to learn about the history of the Great Migration. It's a way to learn about Jacob Lawrence and his life's work. And it's a way to learn about the birds. And again, I think, I know I just, many of the birds that keep these migrations that are still native to Colorado, of course, are pretty significant. They're food birds. They're the geese and the turkeys. We have an assortment of songbirds, and you can imagine, those songs following the people as they transition worlds. Um, we have a predator bird and a woodpecker bird and whatever, but you kind of get an assortment of birds that share our spaces, and we hope to kind of flesh out ways or plants or the insects that support the birds in turn so that people can think about how to include them in our own garden spaces. This is the Stepping Stones workshop that happened just very recently. Um, the second one got a little snowed out, so we're actually postponed it to May 18th of this next, in a few weeks. It was a lot of fun. And what we ended up doing to answer the very early question of getting them out of the molds is we unscrewed the molds and kind of took them apart enough so that they could pop out. So we're looking forward to the next ones. I think the way we're going to do it differently is going to be by using the traditional cement instead of the fast setting cement. I felt like people were a little rushed to get everything in place before the fast setting cement actually set. So I think that will be the biggest change. But otherwise, this photo kind of gives you a sense of how we're tucking the access to the garden kind of behind the fence towards the street. And we'll be putting up more signs to invite people to discover the space kind of in that way. This is some of the details of the patterns that were done. I think they're beautiful. I'm really excited about how they turned out. I wanted to, the patterns, the follow the stars idea came from a tea that we hosted with Grace, who is seen here in green, at a tea that we hosted with her to welcome the quilters of G's Bin to town, which was a really just extraordinary gathering. That was the third tea that we hosted with Grace in regards to quilts. Quilts were a passion for her. The first one was a book signing for a book called Hidden in Plain View, and it followed or it decoded these quilt squares and how they were used as secret code along the Underground Railroad, which I think is a really extraordinary way that people offered help and guidance. So it was, the idea that Miss Mabel thought of, well, we need to formalize this path through the garden to invite people to slow down and consider what we're doing here. And we need to tie in quilts because that was a passion for Grace. If we think of the people who traveled on the Underground Railroad, out of sheer necessity, they would have to have this incredibly close relationship and understanding with the landscape to be able to survive. So we like how that has all come together, and the patterns are beautiful in themselves, and we're looking forward to continue doing that through the spring. um so just to round out, these are a list of days that I will be working in the garden. And welcome any people, anyone to come by and discover the space, discover how to participate, discover the center itself. So several Saturdays in the spring, um, and then Juneteenth, the actual day of Juneteenth. I think the center will be open the prior weekend as well. I think there's some festivals happening around the Five Points area, which should be fun. And I think that Grace used to make a tradition of serving watermelon and red pop, so you can get a refreshment if you happen by. But um, but I'll be in the garden starting this Saturday afternoon, and then the Stepping Stones workshop is going to be on the 18th. I'll return again on June 8th and then on June 19th. And pictured here are a couple of students from the Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative who jumped in and spent a day in the garden, which was wonderful. So that's it for me. That's what I prepared. If people have questions or comments.
So much. I so much. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? And you're free to just speak up if you do.
I was wondering if the garden is complete, are you just maintaining it, or are you going to add more?
Um, it is still very much a work in progress. Um, so we're it's just getting established. So a lot of the plants that you saw that are taking hold, it's really exciting that they're taking hold. There's a lot of space for more plants, and there's a lot of space to diversify the plant collection. So, and then also in this interior space, they laid down there so you can see some vinca and then you can see some really open space. I think the approach they took was to seed some grass and then use a lot of pretty big bark mulch around little bits of vinca and it's starting to fill it. And then they planted the salvia. Um, I think there's a lot of fleshing out that there's a lot of potential that we can lend to or we can realize in this internal space. The PS You Are Here grant really is dedicated to that space between the sidewalk and the street. So that support is focused on that area. But we would love for people to come and join in diversifying both the interior and the exterior spaces for sure. I think one of the events we did with the Colorado Native Plant Society this winter was a seed swap, which was a lot of fun. And we ended up with a lot of seeds that we've sown in the gardens and we're seeing what comes up. But ultimately, we envision it as what I like to think of as a living seed library. So really inviting people to come and participate in the garden by harvesting seeds, inviting people with garden know-how to help, pass on plants. One of my favorite things about working in this space is really convening with passerbys. People are curious and they want to know about the plants and the stories and the intentions and the figures that we're featuring. Um, and it's awesome to be able to be like, try, this is, try it in your own garden. This is the most important part about this is you know, respectfully kind of engaging with this space in a way that offers potential to neighborhood gardens as well, mostly through seeds. But as I said, we're digging up a lot of Russian sage. Yeah, try it. Looking forward to, of course, passing on the native plants that I'm looking forward to, really taking hold to the point where they will need to be dug out and passed on as well, right?
Lily, I'm looking at this calendar and we will definitely put all of these dates in our calendar. But
Thank you.
also our garden tour is on June 8th and 9th. So we could definitely like collaborate and have the plant sale be at Stiles.
That would be a lot of fun. Yeah, we would love that.
Okay, that would be great. And I think Ann Beard's on the call with us. I know one day we were gonna go do some Aurora stuff because we were thinking about like the Sand Creek Greenway and Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and we had like 3 gardens in Aurora that were on the survey last year, but we didn't get to visit them. So that might be one day. But then the other day, let's try to push that to the 9th and try to land at Styles for the 8th.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'll think about some potential gardens that would fit in the area as well.
Well, folks, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you, and we'll send out the recording when it is made. And if you would like to reach out to me or Lily, we'll put our emails in the chat.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, folks, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Maggie.
Yeah, we'll see you soon and have
Yeah.
a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.